All right, we should be live. If you can hear this and the sound is good, well, hopefully it's good, but let me know. The last thing I recorded, for some reason, the sound was a little messed up. So hopefully this is not. The I need heroin thing doesn't really help me with the sound. So the yeses are good, hopefully. Because for some reason I think I just had the settings, like the sound too high or something on the last thing I recorded. Please love me. Yes, I do. I don't know you, but I do. Can you make a Datura video? It's one of those that I did cover a long time ago, but I'm not really happy with it. So I believe it's down. May not be. You can look. But yeah, I will make a new one eventually. I have a few videos in the works right now. They're the same ones that I talked about in the pinned comment on the last video for MDPHP. So theanine, LSD, ODSMT. ODSMT is probably the one that'll go up soon. And then there's also a podcast that's going to be coming out. Sound is as good as the heroin. Well, it's high praise. How about a fentanyl video? I believe... Isn't there a fentanyl video up? It's short. I do want to have a new one. But I believe there is one. Just isn't quite ideal. Love your channel. Learned a lot from you. Thank you. I'm glad you have. Greatly appreciate your content. Keep it going. Yes, I will. I used some of your sources from your HPPD video to help me write a research paper for university. That's awesome. Glad I could provide those sources, link to them, and describe them. What am I streaming about? Nothing in particular, but I know it's been a while since I published something. There is stuff coming in the next week or two. I've just been pretty busy with other things, but I wanted to do a stream considering. Have you read about the FDA approval of ketamine nasal spray as a treatment for depression? Yes, I have. I think it doesn't make a ton of sense. It'd just be nice if ketamine itself, which is cheaper racemic ketamine used intravenously or intramuscularly, unfortunately that's way more expensive than it should be. However, S-ketamine in the nasal spray form is even worse. And even though S-ketamine is the main NMDA antagonist and is probably the main thing that contributes to the antidepressant effects, I don't know. There should just be cheaper racemic ketamine. Not really thinking that there's a benefit. And I don't know how the pricing is going to work out because a lot of people would not be able to afford that. Do a video about mescaline. I definitely will. I wish there was a synthetic classroom or synthesis classroom. Yeah, it's not really my thing. Interested in it, but not trying to teach people how to make drugs. What do you think of the series Breaking Bad? Well, I loved it. Obviously, there is a drug connection, but mostly kind of, well, not super relevant. But it was a great show. Do I have a video on heroin? I don't. Unfortunately. I will, of course. Why not THC? Is that about doing a video on it? If so, I definitely want to. There's a really big topic in cannabinoids and cannabis in general are just such a big topic that I don't want to wade into it without being more comfortable with all the information. Imagine Breaking Bad with LSD instead. Probably be a little less interesting. Do you have an option for 2FMA, or is there another one like Vyvanse? Do you just mean a drug similar to 2FMA? Nothing comes to mind because the main pull of 2FMA, at least for some people, it wasn't really the case for me, and I know it isn't for everybody, but it did tend to last pretty long and was relatively free of physical annoying side effects. So people refer to it as a good RC replacement or alternative to Vyvanse, which I think is fair, having used both, even though 2FMA was not as good for me as it could be for other people. But no, nothing really comes to mind. Obviously, there's other fine RC stims, but I'm not sure about as clean or long lasting. 3 FPM is good. I want to watch a version of Breaking Bad with its MDMA, not meth. Uh, sure, that'd be. I don't know. Just what's it gonna be? A bunch of craziness at festivals? Don't know if that'd be as cool. Meth has a cool allure to it in the popular culture that I don't know if a lot of other drugs have. What's the best antidepressant for hating life? Therapy. Not a drug, but, you know. Did I do one on methadone? No, it's been heavily requested after the current set of videos. There's like 4 in the works, not including podcasts. Methadone will probably be one of the next ones. What kind of drug is hot too? Is a psychedelic. Pretty relatively unknown. I have a short page on it, but yeah, there's not much information. I don't know if it's short because there's truly only this amount. This page went up when I, given how bad the structure image is, clearly this was a long time ago. And thank you to Bronze, who's moderating in the chat, for doing the much superior structures. But anyways, I think there might be a little more information than is on the page. Basically just dose and whatnot. But yeah, psychedelic. What drug do you recommend for pain? Well, it depends on your condition. Neuropathic pain is a lot different than you hurt your shoulder or stub your toe. If it's just an acute thing that doesn't require hospital treatment, then often things like ibuprofen, if your stomach agrees with it, is fine. And often compared to a codeine or even other opioids, ibuprofen actually does pretty well in studies. But obviously not for every type of pain. Really just depends. I mean, you're probably going to have a good option recommended to you if you have an actual condition going on. And then I would recommend going with whatever your doctor says. But the main things are opioids, NSAIDs, gabapentinoids, other channel blockers like antidepressants, old antidepressants for neuropathic pain. Seth, is LSD only called LSD because of where Hoffman was? Yes, and that's why, as you noted, it should be LAD, based upon our name for it, and other drugs are. So, well, other RCs are sometimes more often referred to as LAD, Ethlad, and Allad, etc. Three FPM, do you think it's possible to find? I don't know. Who's in the next podcast? Well, Zach Rhodes. I was on his podcast, actually. I'll post a link to that. He's a therapist, and he's coming out with a new book with Stanton Peele, who's a psychologist who's really well known in the addiction field. So we were talking about addiction, of course. And sorry for the typing. Hopefully it's not too terrible. So here is, it's pulling up so slow. Here is the link where I was on his podcast a while back. Maybe it was said before, what type of education do you have? Are you a doctor, pharmacist, technician, hobby person? Used to be a hobby person, now I'm in university studying biotech, and my intention is for doctorate education, pharmacology, but right now I'm still in university for biotech. Seth, what is your drug of choice? Depends on what I'm using it for, but the things I kind of go for most are things specifically for sleep, so more recently GBL, and then for a longer period of time benzodiazepines if I have trouble sleeping. Besides that, pregabalin and entactogens. How do you pass a drug test? Don't use drugs. Otherwise, I'm not aware of any of the things that are typically recommended, like, trying to, people use niacin, things like that to try and change it. It's not going to work. Like those recommendations, I'm not aware of any that actually work. Do you regret DMT with Adam from Psych Substance? Regret? In what way? I'm not a huge fan of having videos where I take drugs be online, and I think I'm going to shy away from that in the future. But the video that's currently up, it is what it is. It's fine. Somebody got bad chronic tinnitus from pregabalin. Thoughts? I researched it a bit, and I don't remember. I have a comprehensive page that you can look at, which is basically going to tell you everything that I know about pregabalin because I try to make it pretty comprehensive. I don't remember anything about that. Some people do. I don't know. I think I've seen some reports of people acutely having it, but yeah, I don't know. But feel free to look on the site, and unfortunately, the page is kind of in a slightly older format, which isn't that as good, but maybe find some information there. Do I use cannabis? Pretty infrequently. I'm not a huge fan of the experience, and more recently, when I do occasionally use it, which is almost always because I am having trouble sleeping, I try to go for high CBD because I'm in a state where it's legal to get cannabis now, and it's therefore a lot easier to go to a dispensary and find a specific thing that works and has a great breakdown. Unfortunately, CBD heavy ones are still a bit less common than, well, actually way less common than high THC ones, but yeah, it works. Is the pharmacology field lucrative? There are a lot of options in just biomedical research, pharmaceutical companies. A lot of people will go for grant-based stuff at universities and they teach. Yeah, there's a lot of options. And all those are on the table for me depending on how well TDC does and how extensive or expansive I see TDC being able to be, which is to say, I'll go into potentially one of those fields in pharmacology if TDC is not my only thing, although I don't imagine TDC ever not being at least a part-time thing for me. Should salvia and kratom be legal in America? Definitely. Do you think LSD causes notable damage? Based on everything that we know so far, we can pretty much say physically it's non-toxic, and that applies both acutely and possibly chronically. The main thing that comes to mind is one thing we were talking about earlier, which is HPPD, and it's pretty minimally researched, so there's not many theories as to how it occurs. One of the few that does exist is some kind of neurotoxicity, but that has never really been proven. So based on everything we know so far, you can pretty much say non-toxic. I am researching LSD to do a video on it. It's very interesting to see how one of the few instances where a persistent drug myth, in this case LSD causing genetic problems, damage to chromosomes, that kind of stuff, actually was based in a good bit of science in the 60s and 70s, and then pretty much the idea was thrown out. But basically, if you were living in 1968, the most scientifically sound thing to say might have, or a reasonable scientific thing to say, would have been that it causes significant chromosomal damage and could cause birth defects and all sorts of stuff. Luckily, that is not true. Should Atizolam be approved in the US? I see no reason that it should not be approved. I don't know that it provides any benefit, but as in it provides something truly unique compared to what's on the market already. However, some people just respond better to a particular benzodiazepine or in this case, benzodiazepine functioning drug. So I, put it on the market. Sure. What do you think about the recent tumbles in the darknet markets? All I knew, because I was looking at it weeks ago at this point, was Dream Market shutting down, but was planning to come back up, I think by this time, this month. Has it? Yeah, I'm kind of out of the loop. I've been doing other stuff for a bit. You should mention the one incident or case where 8 people actually snorted LSD powder, and, well, I'm sure there's more people than that who have done that. Are you talking about ones where? Yeah, I don't think you're talking about ones where they died or had some kind of, fatal response. Yeah, that's interesting. It might be among the ones that I am already planning to mention, but yeah, thank you for the recommendation. What's your opinion on paracetam, methylphenidate, similar drugs used to boost studying? Well, I'd place racetams and similar nootropics away from the methylphenidate and amphetamines of the world. For the most part, there's very little evidence on what racetams do, at least good evidence, and once you get past paracetam, the research really declines. The anecdotal reports cannot be dismissed. I think there is some potential that these mechanisms could be useful for cognition or, things like holistic thinking or creativity with aniracetam, but it's really not supported by much research. I think they are, so far, even though this is also coming with the same low research caveat, there's not much evidence that they're harmful, and they don't have any obvious acute negatives that you experience. Unlike amphetamines or methylphenidate, there can be some acute negatives that are a little more substantial than what can happen with racetams. So I think from that respect, get them and try them, see if they work. It seems reasonable that they could work. I'm just not sure. As to methylphenidate, amphetamines, for the most part, they definitely can boost attention. They can boost motivation. If you're including that in cognition, then sure. Once you get past that, memory and executive thinking, there's relatively little evidence. There's a little bit, but, I even covered this, I think, with maybe methylphenidate. I did a video that was a study overview, and they were finding no difference compared to placebo, I believe. If I'm remembering the study correctly, it was a couple of years ago that I published it. Is there a known LD50 for LSD? Yes, in animals there are LD50s. There's little reason to think that you couldn't die, but for the most part, people are not encountering nearly enough LSD that could even potentially be deadly. Do placebo benzos exist? I'm unsure what you mean. If you just mean studies that were looking at benzodiazepines and they had a placebo group and there was a positive effect of the placebo, yes, those studies definitely exist. And pretty much for anything, you can get a not insignificant portion of the people you give placebo to respond in the way that the active drug does, or at least pretty close to it. Hey Seth, what are your thoughts on DXM? I covered it pretty comprehensively on the website and on the video, in the video for DXM, which wasn't that long ago. That pretty much encompasses, my information on the substance. I've used it a little bit on my own, but if you have a specific question, maybe I could respond. Any research on cannabis's influence on self-esteem that you're aware of? No, I'm not. It's an interesting topic, but I don't think it has been studied. Seth, why did you unlist your video on ALD52? For the most part, any of those old videos, I'm really not a fan of, and I just don't want there to be videos out there getting a lot of attention that don't comprehensively cover stuff, are not referenced in nearly the way that I now reference things. Although for something like ALD52, there's not a ton to look at for research anyways, so it probably wasn't too off the mark from what I would put out now. But in general, if something has been unlisted, it's pretty much for that reason. I have different standards now, and I would like everything on the channel to meet those standards. You don't have a video on amphetamine. I do have a video on Adderall, and Adderall is just a preparation of amphetamine, slightly more biased to dextro than the just racemic amphetamine. But the information in there, which again, I do want to come out eventually with a much better Adderall or amphetamine video, but for the time being, that does exist. Are DXM visuals intense? They're not. It's not known for visuals, but you can definitely get really strong distortions as you get to higher doses. That applies to dissociatives in general. So a lot of depth perception impairment and blurriness and vision splitting or splicing, where your vision kind of gets cut up into smaller portions. Don't exactly know how to describe it, although you can go to Psychonaut Wiki and they have good pages on these visual effects that include some or replications, the subreddit. Both of those sources have good replications of this stuff. But yeah, for the most part, they're much lower quality visuals and much less complex visuals. Do you think we'll ever run out of new drugs because we found every psychoactive substance that exists? I don't. There's just too much that can potentially work in the brain. Hey, I'm looking into research chems with similar properties to Adderall. Do you know of any? Well, a lot of the substituted amphetamine ones that have come out, so 2-FMA, 3-FA, for some people 3-FPM, can all be good for what Adderall is good for. So more or less recreating the primary positives and negatives of Adderall. I haven't specifically mentioned it yet, but the usual stuff, if you want to support, there's ways to do so. And you can look in the description of this live stream to find ways to donate, or you can go to thedrugclassroom.com/support. Also, there's a Discord, which is a chat room, chat server, and you can follow that link to join that if you want to interact with me and other people. Do I play video games? Basically, no. I used to play them a bit, but yeah, no. Thoughts on Dr. Z? I think he's a cool mathematician / chemist, whatever his actual title is. I think mathematician, who's also good at chemistry. What is GBL? It's a precursor to a prodrug to GHB, which is used medically for sleep in narcolepsy, though in the form of sodium oxybate, sold as Xyrem. I do have a video on that as well. But yeah, it does that, has a faster, shorter duration, can be a more intense peak. Upcoming guests on the TDC podcast, there's only one, the one I mentioned earlier, who's a therapist who is who's coming out with a new book, and we talked about addiction. But I'm currently in a university semester and wrapping that up. Once that is done, I'll probably be able to get to more podcasts and also more videos. I know they're really getting spaced out. I continue working on them, but it's just taking a little bit of time to get them out. Thoughts on Atizlam? I think it's totally fine. What do you think of academic in general? Don't know quite what you mean. Thoughts on DPT? Really interesting one, other psychedelics such as 5-MeO or DMT that have a dissociative, immersive element to them at their peak. Yeah, I'm not running out to try it. It kind of, compared to DMT, even though that's also very intense, the qualities of a DPT experience, which I covered a bit in a video about DPT, the qualities kind of I'm not running to experience that as fast as DMT. Have a great day, Seth. You too. Are there any real negative effects of 2CB? Yes, and they're basically the same as negative effects from acutely negative effects from other psychedelics. And if you really overdid it, then drugs in the 2C series, the DOX, the NBOM, etc., those drugs are all substantially more concerning than LSD and overdose, so don't do it. But overall, stick to a reasonable dose and you'll be pretty much okay. Do you ever visit events like Harm Reduction Conference or Club Health Conference in Amsterdam? I've never been to Amsterdam. I'd love to go. I do go to some events pretty infrequently. I went to one at Columbia University a couple weeks ago, which was great. It was hosted by Dr. Carl Hart and Mark Graffel. And yeah, that was great. But no, unfortunately, I haven't gone to those ones. Have you seen the new Netflix documentary on weed? No. I'm kind of doubtful it's much different than the ones that exist already. Who knows Seth's major in school? I'm not going to go into school, though it's probably out there somewhere. But biotechnology, so kind of focused on exploiting cellular and molecular biology, which is essentially what it would be. It's a smaller school. If it was a larger school, most likely I'd be in cell/molecular biology and focused on that. But where I am, it's biotech. How did you get Hamilton Morris on the show? I contacted him and asked, and eventually he did. It took a while, but he did. And it was great. I'm very happy with that podcast. Datura is not safe. For the most part, I agree. What do you think about WSM exit scam, other darknet market stuff? It seems like a lot's going on in that space that I missed in the past month or so. It's probably a month ago that I looked at any of it. Yeah, that's unfortunate if so. Obviously, I'm not a fan of people scamming people on the darknet. I think the darknet can be a real force for good in the drug area. So it's unfortunate to see any negative stuff happening. If I can't afford the medications I need here in the US, what do you think about acquiring the medications from India or Canada online? Well, at least for Canada, there are some legitimate pharmacies that you get a drug prescribed, you show them the documentation for that, and then you can get your medication if it's not a controlled drug. So you can't do this, I believe, for benzos or Adderall, stuff like that, which is unfortunate because some controlled drugs are pretty expensive. Pregabalin comes to mind, and I don't think you can get it from those providers in Canada. But for other stuff, you could potentially get it cheaper. If you're talking about just general online pharmacies, especially those that don't require proof of prescription, be very, very cautious because they're quite known to be selling illegitimate or at least not adequately verified substances. So I wouldn't, even though some certainly are sending out drugs, especially from a place like India where the controls are not nearly as strict, clearly, on the pharmaceutical industry. Yeah, I would be just very cautious. Which substance are you most fascinated with? I'm Anybody who's followed me for a bit knows that I find deliriance pretty interesting. I I'd have to think about it more, but I'd give a tentative answer of deliriance still, even though yes, please do not take them just because they're legal and you have access to nothing other than Benadryl. What are your thoughts on ashwagandha? I think it definitely has positive effects. There's a little bit of research. Go to examine.com. That's a really good place to look up research for supplements. Yeah, I think it works. I use it myself and I've received a benefit for years. I don't use it all the time, but it definitely I feel as though it does something personally, and I think there is research behind it for reducing the stress response and reducing the issues that can stem from that, sometimes depression, anxiety, etc. Can you trip on Benadryl? Yes, but as I was saying, don't. How do you think that alcohol compares to a lot of drugs effects wise? Well, I don't know. I mean, that's kind of a complex thing. It does, as you get to higher doses, it has more than just kind of GABAergic type effects and gets into more dissociative effects and some weirdness. It's pretty interesting because it's fairly promiscuous as a substance. So I don't think it fits neatly into any category. Although sedative is the best one for it as it's typically used, though really still does not encompass quite what alcohol does. Yeah, there's nothing really that replicates that pharmacology quite the same way. Though at low doses, of course, things like benzodiazepines and other anti anxiety substances can offer similar stuff to what a drink or two does. But as you get to those higher, more weird levels of alcohol, it kind of transforms into something pretty unique. Thoughts on SSRIs? They work. They're also overprescribed or improperly prescribed. Easier if you have a more specific question. Not criticizing yours, it's a fine question. But if you have a more specific thing about SSRIs for me to comment on, it's easier because it's a really big topic. And I can't go into an overview of SSRIs right now. And I did cover one and a lot of the information in that video, which was on sertraline, also known as Zoloft. That information, although not perfectly, will carry over to a lot of other SSRIs. So you can look to that for some information. And one of the other videos that's really close to being released is one on antidepressant withdrawal, focused on all forms of antidepressants, but primarily SSRIs. So I'll be covering that aspect because I think it's an under discussed but really important thing that impacts a lot of patients, and it leads to them having really negative views of the drugs and being blindsided by negative effects when they try to get off. Give me just a second. I'm being told by Bronze, the moderator, to do something. So let me switch some settings over. All right. Possibly did the correct thing. And if so, Ben slash Bronze might be joining. Although, of course, the audio is screwed up and I don't have the right settings. Try to answer another question while working on this. What do you think about being on SSRIs for your entire life? If it works and they're a clear net positive, then I think that's totally fine. I don't have any issue with that. Can you tell me the names of all the current fentanyl analogs? No, there's a bunch. And Ben, I believe, well, I do hear you, but, and he should be joining the stream. But the sound is screwed up right now, so let's fix this. Okay, now it might be working. Tell me if you hear another person talking who's not me right now. Ben, talk. Or not. Maybe he disappeared. Best drug slash supplement for social anxiety? I would. Well, drugs, so for including, medications, benzos can be good. If you don't take too much, then they just become impairing and you can do, sub-ideal things. Yeah, everybody's saying no because Ben is actually not talking. He was before. Now he is. Okay. Okay, that's probably too loud. Let me turn that down.
Sorry, I turned my mic up. I'd put it quiet.
Okay.
Also, Dade says to put on Do Not Disturb so it doesn't beep.
All right. That might be really loud. Sorry about that. Did you hear somebody else talking? Okay. It's working. Now there are two people. Although if it was quiet, that's not ideal.
I could hear myself on the stream, but I don't know if the volume's correct.
Also, I'm seeing stuff like the chat's delayed, as always. So they might be commenting on how it was before.
There was quite a delay between the chat and your answers, so I don't know if it's just because the stream's a bit delayed.
Oh, back to that question about anxiety drugs. Yeah, benzodiazepines, gabapentinoids, I think, can be pretty good.
It's a good choice, I think, for a lot of cases.
Mm-hmm. And for supplements, theanine, for some people, ashwagandha will work, but theanine often does help.
With coffee specifically, it tends to be. It varies a lot based on what people say, it seems. But it's worth a try, I guess.
I need to figure out a way to boost your sound.
I can turn my mic up. I can turn it up more.
Okay, yeah, can try.
Okay, I've turned it up quite a bit. I may now be way too loud.
Do you think sugar should be considered a drug? No.
I'm gonna turn it up a tad more, but it sounds like it's almost like fine now.
Or yeah, in theory, it should be good. Because it's totally good on my side. I'm just trying to figure out if for some reason it's not coming through
No, I
for
got
them.
it.
Okay, now I can hear him fine, and then the next one is he is still quiet. Well, I don't know. Should work.
I don't know if you're. I'll put it up, but I don't know if it's because
Well,
when
there
I
might be
go to
something.
you.
There might be something bottlenecking it with the
Well,
streaming thing.
I was checking through the stream. I put it up to 100%. I'll see how it is now. I'll listen.
All right. What's your ideal job, Seth? TDC. I have gabapentin, but it stops new connections from being made, which is to say, it impairs. There is evidence that it might impair neurogenesis and memory formation.
Ooh, sorry.
And if that's the case, which anybody who's been on it for a while, a good portion of them do end up reporting some cognitive impairment, memory issues. So, yeah, it's not ideal.
What's that for
That was
specifically?
for gabapentin.
Oh yeah,
And even acutely, yeah, it can be impairing.
it
Also,
does
Ben, I
impair
hear
usage
myself
a
a
lot
little
as
bit
well.
through you.
Oh, sorry, I'm close to my mic. I think you're a bit loud. Mine's at
Ah,
100%, and you're still quite a bit louder than me.
okay, that could
And
do it.
your mic is even quite loud in the voice chat.
Mm.
I will say, um, as much as with regard to gabapentinoids versus benzos for anxiety or whatever, it's there can be a lot. Some people do report cognitive impairment with gabapentin and with pregabalin and whatever, but I feel it's quite possibly, of course, that does is also often present with benzos, but a lot of the time it's more so that you don't really notice it with the benzos, even if it's lower doses. It's um, you can often be it can be like slight slowing or whatever in terms of like just thinking or whatever or those kind of regards. That's just personally, but also from what I've read.
Does cannabis cause more anxiety in the long term? Yeah, my mic seems to be loud. That might be part of the reason.
Yeah,
Uh,
it can
let me.
vary lots. The with regard to the cannabis thing, a lot by person to person. I mean, a lot of the time because there's the ironic, strange duality of, and also with regard to strains and content and whatever. There's the issue of how certain people find it anxiolytic, some people find it anxiety causing, and even the same person can find both at different times. It can vary quite a lot depending on person and whatever.
How was meeting Hamilton Morris like? I didn't meet him. We recorded remotely. My goodness, these. Oh, there we go. Uh, might be working. Do you feel you are normalizing drug experimentation amongst younger users? I don't. I think 99% of the people that come in contact with my videos already know about drugs, hence them coming to contact. And I don't think I'm the deciding factor for if people are experimenting.
If anything, you can often it's I agree with that definitely, but also it can be that you're introducing it to them or making them aware of uh, like sensible manners of use and harm reduction and whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Because quite often it is people are finding the videos somehow, to say at the very least.
Mm-hmm.
Someone asked about Ergine. or the LSA. And my response, as it always is LSA is supposedly not active from when people have tried it itself. Obviously, what's it called? I'm going blank on the two names. Hawaiian, Baby Wood Rosa, and whatever
Morning
seeds.
Glory.
The two Morning Glory. They are active, psychologically, but it's thought by at least some people that that it's not from specifically LSA because it doesn't seem to be active when it's used on its own. I believe that was, I can't remember who may have been David Nichols.
I don't.
Someone.
Yeah, when I looked into it, I didn't see much about it. But
there isn't much about it. It seems to be one source, if anything, that's stated it. But then there's not much to the contrary either, apart from, and by that I don't mean obviously the facts of the plants, the seeds working is that's not really countering it.
what is LSA? It is a psychedelic, potentially, though also sometimes classified as a depressant. That's how it is classified by the government. But yeah, it's found in Hawaiian baby wood rose seeds and morning glory seeds. So some people use it as a not quite legal but easier to access way of getting some kind of psychedelic experience, because those
Active in the GI tract, to say the very least, according to all of the reports.
Yeah, and it does have
downside.
psychedelic effects. The exact thing in those seeds causing the effects
Or
isn't necessarily known.
Things.
Yeah, or multiple drugs. Yeah.
In response to Georg, I think is how you say it, Thorman, saying about nicotine over a longer time, it's hard to say because obviously the idea of addiction is kind of a vague thing. I will say, at the very least, I used dual pods for quite a while, for around a month or 2 or 3 recently, and then just haven't, and it really wasn't difficult for me personally. It can vary. If anything, is in my experience less than the drive of caffeine, though. On the other hand, when people talk about nicotine, often it's with regard to tobacco, in which case the combination with the harmaline alkaloid and whatever in it can often be a recipe for more prominent addiction to it, as is obvious with cigarettes and whatever.
Yes, I finally figured out how to change the volume. It took playing with 10 different settings, but yes, now we look similar.
Good job.
Yes.
Sounds
Isn't
similar.
everybody proud of me? It's very impressive I was able to do this. How do I support TDC when I don't know what it is? Well,
watch all of the content.
Watch some of the videos, and you'll become familiar.
The Q&As are though there's not many recent Q&As, but watch a few of the overviews, and watch a few of the overviews. Maybe watch one of the specific topic news story style videos, and maybe some of the Q&As if you want to know about Seth specifically. Essentially, watch everything. And also check out the website. The website, if a lot of people seem to, or a collection of people seem to not notice that there's the website specifically with all of the sources for all of at least the current up to standard videos.
For more recent
videos, are all there, and goes a lot more in depth online as well.
Yeah, for recent videos, you can pretty much see an annotated version, an expanded version of the video with references and and more information and tells you where I got what I'm saying from for any individual fact. Yeah.
They're not, you're getting, there's not going to be any necessarily juicy information or contrary information that's to a significant contrary information necessarily that wasn't mentioned in the video typically.
Seth, would you ever look into exploring peptides on this channel? Yes, there's a fair chance I will.
The Brat has asked about ALD 52 and 1P being prodrugs, or are they, in their opinion, completely self-psychotropic? I would say, oh, I'm apparently very loud. I will move away from my microphone, sorry. I would personally say there is strong evidence to suggest that at the very least they are prodrugs. 1P more so, though ALD is pretty much the same typically. But there is certainly, firstly, the possibility of psychoactivity in themselves, in addition, which maybe have some amount of significance with their overall, how they seem overall. But also, it's important to note that a lot of people seem to they're as much as something might be a prodrug, it still is a prodrug. It needs to turn into it, which can affect the timing, the speed at which the essentially the active dosage curve of the actual active drug, which means that in reality you can end up with notably different, especially with psychedelics and whatever, you can end up with notably different feeling things given the fact that it's a prodrug, which can affect the active how it the active dosage curve, and even people often can say that even the same thing can feel entirely different with regard to that class, of course. So it's
typically I just say that LSD, 1P, and ALD can just be viewed as the same.
They are essentially, in my opinion, they are. Those are considerations, especially the latter stuff. Even though they are prodrugs, but they are pretty similar. Their curves seem to be, in terms of the durations and whatever, seem to be pretty similar.
Seth, thoughts on the long-term use of benzodiazepines? Started at 18, now 28. There is some evidence that cognitive impairment is an issue. I mean, anybody who's used benzos can attest to that even acutely they're cognitively impairing. And then from there, most likely they don't produce naturalistic sleep, which is not good if you're doing that all the time. Even though a lot of people use them for sleep, I think they should just be an acute, short-term aid for insomnia if that's your issue. And you should find alternative things like CBTI, a behavioral therapy intervention for insomnia if you're going to be using something all the time or need insomnia to be fixed all the time. But other people, use them for anxiety and other conditions, and kind of the same stuff applies. It's probably not great. There probably is cognition. There probably are cognition issues in the long term, and physically they're pretty safe, but there are studies showing that even after abstinence for a bit of time, cognition might continue to be impaired, which suggests maybe some kind of really persistent quote-unquote withdrawal or toxicity, although there would need to be more evidence for either of those to call them that. But something might persist beyond use if you've been on them for a long time, usually with pretty high doses, but even with lower amounts. So yeah, it's not ideal, but we have to consider how they are in the context of what are you using them for, and if they're really providing relief, and without them, like they're the best thing that you could be using for whatever you have, then some negative effects don't necessarily justify not using. But sure, if you can find an alternative for whatever you're treating, I would say that definitely is ideal. Have I done a video on tizanidine? No, I have not. Probably will be a while before I do. Does anyone know a good website for RCs? All of us would surely love to help, but we can't. Yeah, but there is no sourcing here,
Also,
and no sourcing in the chat room.
In reality, not mentioning it, but if you're looking, it entirely depends on where you live,
Yes,
and
that's
also
a really good
a
point.
lot of considerations for risks and what you want or whatever.
Yes, and you
Though
should.
we're not telling you.
But as a general statement, depending on where you are, the laws for things like analogs, even if something is not specifically scheduled, that can really vary. And there's some countries like the US where dealing with personal amounts of an analog coming into the country, not a big concern. It's very,
Yeah.
it's exceedingly rare for that to turn into an issue. But for other countries, that can be a bigger problem.
Yeah.
So you do really have to consider where you are. And
Also, a lot can even depend on for a given country, it can depend on the given website that is being used, as there can be a lot of things like what country it's coming from, and there's a hell load of stuff. Look elsewhere because you're not going to find it here. Also, someone asked, oh, where was it? Someone asked any recommendations, and any recommended detoxes for flushing THC from liver. Not taking in any is about the best you'll get.
yes, and
Yeah, there's not much you can.
in any
As much as
stores
people
you
might say
have,
stuff, there's not much you can do.
it's not really going to be the liver. But as a general statement,
that's
yes,
true.
just don't use, and that's pretty much the main thing that you can do.
Yeah.
Also, Ben, I hear myself a little bit through your audio.
Sorry, that's where I'm getting close to my microphone.
Seth, any new data for potential risks of consuming Atizolam? No. Most of the information that exists on it came out years ago because it's prescribed in some countries, and that's pretty much what we're working with. And most likely there isn't going to be any new substantial information that comes out because it's a pretty well understood substance. Yep. It's a benzodiazepine receptor agonist, and they all do pretty similar things.
Yeah.
Possibly with,
and actually even use is reducing. Yeah. If anything.
I mean, the area that they can vary is partly in being kind of like Z drugs, in that the thing that makes them different is preferentially binding to the benzodiazepine site on different types of GABA receptors, which can make them better at X, Y, or Z. But it doesn't
seem like there's much to come out from that for specifically.
No, and with the benzodiazepine class, we have benzodiazepines covering almost the full range of how those
so
that mechanism could vary.
What it's going to do, and it's not hard to test really. There's really two receptors to test the preference for, and a lot of them are just broad checking all of the classes, all of the compounds in the class pretty much that one can think of, which is why there's often such good information for. Or there's such broad information across the class for things like duration, what's it called? For 50% to get cycled out and stuff like that, and dosages and specific binding between the two, or between
half-life?
Different.
Is that what you're looking for?
Yes, half-life. Okay. Sorry, entirely blanked on it. Between the two different things, the difference is where it's less well known at the extremes, or specifically with different kinds of binding, which is where it is with regard to the benzodiazepine receptors, which is really where the Z drugs are more significant, or variations on the very broad class of Z drugs, such as pagaclone or whatever, where you have interesting stuff going on. Yeah.
As a general rule, what benzotype RC is legal in the US? If it has not been specifically scheduled, you can pretty much treat it as legal, because benzodiazepines are not Schedule 1 or 2. So depending on your state, because a lot of these have been
Yeah,
scheduled at the
laws
state
are where
level,
you've got to check. Yeah,
including
that's what
atizolam.
I was going to say you got to check.
You know,
Yeah.
most of the RC
And
benzos.
there is some risk for. Wait, no. Is it 2? Is it Schedule 2 or 3? Is it
For
covered by the
benzos?
Analog Act? Yeah.
The Analog Act covers 1 and 2.
Yeah. Is it 2?
No, it's like
No. Oh.
4. I believe
okay.
is
So
benzos.
yeah, I was going to say you would have to worry about it in that case, which makes sense that it's not covered by that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You check your state laws is a big thing there because it's like people. Specific states will have possibly had significant atizolam coming in or clonazepam, clonazepam rather, and it can vary a lot with regard to that. Yeah, so that's where you should really look out if you're in the states.
Dextroamphetamine is different from methamphetamine. They're both amphetamine isomers, but not the same substance. That's almost correct, but they're not.
You're
Isomers.
using the word isomer in different ways there. Ooh, someone's in a message that I'm reviewing is telling me to shut up and stop interrupting Seth. I'm trying not to. But I'm not sending your message through because
Yeah, it
saying
happens.
it politely.
Whenever there's two people talking,
There's a
gonna be talking
speech
over
delay.
each other.
It's difficult to not when we're trying to answer the same
That is-
questions.
yes,
and
that is
also
true too.
Be smarter than one another.
Yes.
But
It's a competition.
No. It's not. It's always a competition. No.
There's an article on NIDA that contradicts the current thoughts on the mechanism of benzodiazepine's mode of action. It details how they work on interneurons and so are not direct agonists. Those two things do
they
not.
Aren't direct agonists.
Yeah, well, and those
Are
two
they?
things also don't connect to each other. Like
No.
interneurons is describing the type of cell that they're affecting, and the direct agonist thing is which is not how they
Very
work.
well
They're a
known.
modulator.
Yeah, it's well known that
Yeah, so they're not like some other GABA drugs that work like GABA. They enhance GABA. So yeah, they're not direct
receptor,
agonists.
yeah. There are interesting things. Like I said, there are interesting things with regard to unique or slightly strange or not that well known mechanistic differences with regard to Z drugs and those kind of substances, but there's not really with benzodiazepines, and that's just with specifics with regard to binding at the benzodiazepine receptor. That's not. There's no groundbreaking different stuff, really.
How many micrograms of LSD should one take to feel 150 micrograms worth of effects while on 100 milligrams of sertraline? That there's no way to give a direct answer.
Yeah.
Most likely.
Also, is that not somewhat dangerous?
Yeah, well, I'll get to that in a sec. The first thing is you can often get them to work better than, say, how MDMA is affected by SSRIs like sertraline, but your inherent tolerance increases just because of, well, one, competition from elevated serotonin, which is postulated to be one of the main mechanisms of SSRIs, and downregulation of the psychedelic receptor 5-HT2A by chronic exposure to high serotonin. And things like downregulation of 2A have been shown, and that's why the tolerance increases. But that amount of tolerance, baseline tolerance change, that's going to vary between everybody, and therefore really hard to say an amount. So yeah, I can't say an amount. As to serotonin syndrome or just being dangerous in general, most of the time you're not going to run into an issue. There's a little bit of evidence that combining SSRIs or other serotonergic antidepressants with a 2A agonist, because 2A is the main target for serotonin leading to serotonin toxicity, that combination could be dangerous. This has mostly been shown with phenethylamine drugs in that are psychedelics, so things like the 2C and 2C NBOME series, not LSD. And given the quite significant lack of studies, or case reports, I should say, looking at LSD combined with SSRIs leading to serotonin toxicity. It's not likely a huge risk. And yeah, I mean, in 99% of cases, that most likely will not be an issue. It is a hypothetical risk, however. How often is this live stream? Well, the prior one was probably half a year ago, so not very often. And I really can't say how often it's going to be. Why do I focus better on methylphenidate versus Adderall? That varies quite a bit between people. For some people, phenidates functioning as reuptake inhibitors are just preferable, and the exact breakdown of dopamine versus norepinephrine for methylphenidate compared to amphetamine could be preferable. Though I don't remember what that breakdown is.
Ultra Gauss is has said that if you're using methylphenidate at a dose for ADHD, that it will not induce any kind of tolerance, and also that combining with alcohol makes it stronger. Can I first say to the second thing that the conversion to ethylphenidate is insignificant, and other than that, maybe it will get into your bloodstream slightly faster from vasodilation, but that's about it. It really won't. You might feel it more significantly, but that's about it with regard to that bit. Do you have any comment on the
combination
tolerance
thing?
point?
Oh,
no, on
what
the,
was the tolerance thing?
Tolerance thing. It was that if used at dosages for ADHD without euphoria, there will not be any tolerance.
That is not true in the long term.
Yeah,
it's something like
consistently and long enough.
Yeah, if you,
yeah,
I'll actually post a good thing that partly covers this about ADHD drugs in general. Although, was the question about methylphenidate?
Yeah.
Sorry. Unfortunately, this is, I think, only about amphetamine, so it doesn't quite apply. But there is a breakdown here, and I don't remember the stats for methylphenidate, but it's a similar story where when used at a medical dose, there is a change over time. Yeah, and this was what it is for amphetamine, although I know that's not what you were talking about. Unfortunately, I don't have the stats handy for methylphenidate.
But it is very, like, you could quite possibly find a paper on it, and it just logically does make sense that really any dosage that's consistent or slash taken for long enough for consistently will quite possibly induce tolerance. Obviously, it can take a very long amount of time, and it can factor quite a lot on consistency, because at lower dosages, especially, you kind of have more of a break with regard to if it's not very consistent. Lower dosages, it can essentially give your brain a break from it, just based on the timing. But if consistency and the length of it is key, but it should still logically. And I'd be surprised if there weren't papers on it, given it's methylphenidate.
Does amphetamine help people without ADHD for studying? Yes, it does.
Yep.
And the big thing there is not some complex, significant cognition change, but rather you're more motivated, and that it makes even unimportant things more attractive once you get started. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's the main
There
difference.
can be downsides to that and other, whether it's modafinil or Adderall slash any kind of amphetamine based ones, where um, essentially there's the issues of possibly reduced quality of things, possibly being too engaged with other things, like being that motivation can obviously, the idea is a lot of the time people get motivated for insignificant things, which can be detrimental. Or there's I've had even experiences with stuff where, specifically with modafinil a long time ago, where you can spend too much time on things, but as a general rule, as a motivating thing, it should very like it's just a general logical thing that it's like having caffeine. And though there is obviously still the kind of same issue of could make you too jittery or whatever, or overstimulate you, which can be detrimental. But that's kind of, it's just the thing that comes hand in hand with a stimulatory thing like coffee or any of the things mentioned.
When will the MDMA come down end, and will I feel great again? Yes, you should return in within a week, often within a few days, to feeling just like yourself. Interestingly, for those of you who've been on this stream for a while, you heard me talk earlier about, briefly, I was at an event at Columbia University. One of the people I was speaking with there worked on a study where they gave MDMA 3 times in a inpatient setting over like 15 days, and it did become less effective, which is not surprising, but there wasn't really any concern beyond that based upon that study. And I found that interesting. I had not heard of this research. It was pretty impressive that it seems we're actually operating, that like the FDA and other authorities are now just operating with the belief that at reasonable doses given in a fine setting, that the neurotoxicity thing is just not a relevant concern.
I was gonna note earlier when you were saying that it's, and you essentially done the video on this, where it's well known that the key concerns for it are the setting and the factors resultant from that, slash that are controlled with regard to study environments normally, like heat and fluid intake and stuff like that, which makes that kind of individual, somewhat, well, quite close together, repeated sessions with it in a controlled environment, where obviously all of those factors are being controlled just by the nature of it, or manually with regard to things like fluid intake, that it wouldn't necessarily be that harmful. And obviously dosage is a big factor as well.
Do you think drug addiction is caused by a lack of self-care and education on withdrawals and dosages, or can psychological addiction, i.e. enjoying the effects, play a major part? Well, addiction as it's defined medically, where it's not called addiction, and it's kind of a different concept to an extent, but it's really what we should be talking about when we are talking about what's commonly referred to as addiction, which is just a substance use disorder. And that is, unfortunately, by their diagnostic criteria in the DSM and ICD, it includes as relevant symptoms things like tolerance and having to increase your dose over time, even though that really has nothing to do with a substance use disorder. They overlap. That overlaps with the phenomenon of physical dependence very often for obvious reasons, because people are using consistently. But the addiction slash substance use disorder part that we care about, which is people using despite clear negative effects. So they've kind of lost control over, and that's not quite what happens, but how we often talk about it is a loss of control over your behavior, and that leads to, this buildup of negative impacts on your life, such that drug use is no longer rational, and that's when it becomes a disorder. That's almost all psychological, and obviously stemming, as everything does, from neurochemistry and neurobiological functioning. But I think it's really at the psychological level that we should be thinking about addiction, both with what it is, but also how to treat it.
Yeah, the two are very intertwined, but often conflated with each other, and are notably different, distinct things. One of them's a physical phenomena, and one of them is an addiction disorder.
Thoughts on legalization versus decriminalization? Well, decrim is good. I'm not going to complain if that is implemented. And some states are now, or there's some traction on the ground to get things like ballot initiatives in some American states to do just full drug decriminalization. So personal quantities, if you're found, it'll just be similar to a traffic violation. You're not going to have your life, irreparably altered by the fact that you like drugs, which is great. That's a good thing. But legalization, that's what we really need, both for our sake in these nice first world advanced countries like America and places in Europe or Australia, etc. It's important for us, but it's also very, very important for people in other countries that are less advantaged, like those in South and Central America, that are ravaged by having a drug war, having drug prohibition, just because the federal authorities here want to keep people from using substances that they should be allowed to use. That is what is fueling, it's a big thing, fueling corruption in those countries and violence in those countries, leading to thousands of homicides every year of fully innocent people. So yeah, we definitely need legalization, but hey, decrim, that's a good step. Thoughts on HPPD? It's real, and you should watch the TDC video on it. A good MDMA dose, it's pretty much always going to fall between 100, 150 milligrams is a fair amount, and rarely will somebody need to go over 200. Maybe a little bit higher depending on your weight, and if you're taking a redose, which could be a little bit into the experience, like an hour and a half, taking half of your initial dose. But for an initial dose, 100 to 150 based upon your weight is a fair dose. And I believe the rule of thumb that I gave in my content on MDMA was taking your weight in kilograms and then adding 50 to that, and that's the amount in milligrams to use, which is a fair thing to go by.
It seems to give reasonable numbers, though there is still that's obviously still, it's not necessarily a conservative thing. It's definitely a sensible dosage, but you have the issues of purity as one factor, but also often, although body mass is normally less for women, there is the common thing of women seem to be more sensitive to MDMA generally. It seems to be the case. So that may be something to consider, but that is a general rule of thumb. That the weight in kilograms plus 50 as milligrams makes I've used it before, and it's like a very logical thing to it tends to give sensitive values for most people.
Does social media portray illicit substance use as more physically harmful than in reality? For example, healthy people using MDMA and dying of hypothermia, etc. Definitely, those cases are real, and if social media is just referencing a real case, like the recent one that somebody used 3 pills that totaled almost a gram of MDMA and they died
Quite common
in the UK,
yeah,
which is now
It
the
is
common
very
way.
common in the UK.
Yeah. That stuff is
and
real.
and those are the real. Oh yeah, if they're real stories, that's like a genuine thing. Or sometimes they're overblown with regard to the response, but they're actually quite often. You see the parents have said children being like, "Oh, this is why we need testing or whatever." Firstly, because people are taking ridiculous um, doses, but also because the with regard to the education thing, those are the concerns with regard to MDMA use and whatever is the hypothermia and those issues. They are the things that you should be concerned about if you are to be concerned about it, though they are with regard to especially not true stories or just generalizations. Those are quite often overblown with regard to their significance or prevalence.
Somebody asked
Or
about the
often associated with
LD50 of MDMA, so I have it on the screen here. And based upon the animal research, which we have a bit of good data on, it's about 10 to 20 milligrams per kilogram. So it comes out to, which is actually, it comes out to where I tend to recommend people, not go with their dosing. And I basically think anything in the 500 to 800 milligram range is potentially lethal given the right circumstances. Once you're over a gram, even in
There's
other
really no
circumstances,
over 300 for most people, for essentially anyone. Purity is important to consider, but as a general rule, like even as a general rule, considering purity, there's just honestly, you're better off never having more than that. Though obviously, and there the risky amounts are slightly higher than that. But which people do still take because they're stupid and misinformed, and they can be fine from it a lot of the time. Obviously, it's very common in the UK and whatever for those amounts, and people are fine a lot of the time. Though it can be very potentially harmful, especially with regard to possibly neurotoxic effects with regard to overheating and
yeah, I think we're all on the same
being
page
sensible.
that
Yeah,
British people are just crazy, essentially.
yeah, it's true. But and part of that is that purity is notably high here, and we're stupid. That's hence why people will end up having so much that. And also, there's the consideration for purity is often very high, but also you sometimes do just have dud things. So you have all the issues of falsified, like things looking the same but being entirely different ones, and all those kind of issues, which can cause it. But as a general rule, I'd say never go really above 300.
What dose of
those ones are quite obviously risky, like 500 or above.
What dose of psilocybin mushrooms is recommended for a first-time user? I have it on the screen, about 1 to 3 grams. Really depends on the individual batch and depends on the species.
Well. Yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately. So that's why 1 to 3
and
is...
wet or dried.
Yes, these are dried amounts.
Yeah, generally, obviously, those are dried. But yeah, species can matter quite a bit as well. And if you're picking for yourself, obviously, then the wet or dried thing is a lot more of a consideration.
Please, could you make a video about derealization? It's a big topic many don't know about. I would love to make videos about psychological disorders. I probably will, because some of them are things you can experience on drugs and things that are contraindicated with drugs. So it's just useful to have the information available. It's probably not going to come anytime.
Research though.
Yeah, it's not going to come in the immediate future, but I am interested both as, from afar, because I'm interested in those psychological disorders and experiences, but also I've personally experienced dissociative issues, drug related and sober, before. So it's a particular thing that I'd be interested to provide some information on. Modafinil is just a prodrug of armodafinil that's not quite correct.
That's
Modafinil
not true.
is armodafinil with
Or
S-modafinil.
armodafinil. Yeah.
Yeah,
Armodafinil is
armodafinil,
one of the
it's an
optical
isomer.
isomers
Yeah.
of primarily active one, though it's people seem to take that and then take it as a fact that S-modafinil is entirely inactive, which it's not. In fact, it is quite significant, but no, it's not a prodrug. Adrafinil is of modafinil, I believe, right?
Yes.
Armodafinil
Wait.
is not another name for adrafinil. Those are different things.
Yeah, I didn't remember what I was.
Adrafinil
I
is
didn't know what I was agreeing with you on.
Adrafinil is hydroxy N-hydroxy modafinil, I believe. I may be like a methyl off, but I believe it's a prodrug for modafinil.
Mm-hmm.
And armodafinil is just one of the two specific optical isomers or enantiomers in this case of modafinil, and it's the primarily active one, but the other one is active.
Vinny
Someone asked.
says. Vinny says that he has friends who've used extremely high doses of MDMA, ketamine, and cocaine at festivals in the UK, and they show no signs of harmful effects. Were the drugs likely poor quality, or are recommended doses low? Well, the recommended doses for what MDMA is best at, it's not a low dose. I mean, 100 to 150 provides the core experience. The thing is, some people like to go for these really stimulating and just it really intense, like going for the peak you can get from the drug.
The curve really flattens out quite a lot. Obviously, there's still an increase with dosage for MDMA specifically beyond a certain thing, but it's really the curve really becomes more shallow of an increase, and really it just kind of changes to be more stimulatory than not. And people can be, it's very true that people can be perfectly fine from it, but especially in the case of MDMA, it's often that it's not as good for people, or it is good for them, but they're wanting entirely different things. And people can see perfectly fine. It may be purity, but often it's not. I was going to say, someone asked, what are both speakers' backgrounds? Which you kind of answered a bit earlier, but
yes, I'm in university for biotechnology and intending on pharmacology for my doctorate, if everything goes as planned. And Ben is studying chemistry. He's also substantially smarter than I am, so if we contradict each other, then
weird
go with
flex. Seth makes up for it for his encyclopedia of tiny technicalities to
yes,
to correct me on.
Exactly.
It's true. Yeah.
What would be considered a very...
Also... Huh? Sorry, I was interrupting you with a stupid point.
What would be considered a very high dose of modafinil?
Depends what you mean by very high. Like where you're not getting much benefit, or where it's dangerous. Like, because not getting much benefit could be like 200 because you just stop absorbing most of it.
That point,
yeah,
I was not familiar with.
Sorry, I'm interrupting. Yeah, it's pretty. There's a point where you essentially it just starts flushing through mostly. And dangerous, I feel more so. I'm not actually sure what the LD50 would be. I imagine it's quite high. It's probably. I may be misremembering, but it may be the one that's like 1,600 grams in rats. I think that's just off the top of my head.
Milligrams?
Yeah.
Okay.
Look, grams, Jesus Christ. If you fit that in a rat, it's definitely going to be dead. No,
we don't know what happened to the rat. How much did you give?
For some reason, it's not moving anymore. But it's going to be very difficult to have that much. And the main risks are with regard to how long you're having it and sleep and those such issues. You gonna fact check me? I'm pretty sure I got that
No.
right. I have it memorized to a sufficient degree, I think.
Have you considered doing an overview of CBD? Yes, but it's like other cannabis stuff where it'll be a while because there's a lot of research to do, and I want to feel a lot more comfortable with cannabinoid pharmacology before delving into a
You
really
can
complex
even
topic.
recognize synthetic ones.
This is true. This is true. When I see
but
serotonin, I
feel
think it's a synthetic cannabinoid.
this is a cannabinoid B. But I imagine more is probably going to be the order of overviews. At least would probably be cannabis generally, which would be a very big one. All of these would be very big ones, and then maybe THC, and then maybe CBD. Though there's possibly, I imagine there's possibly the. This is literally just he doesn't. For everyone listening, this is just me saying this to Seth off the top of my head. I can imagine there being the possibility of CBD or a CBD kind of news style video with regard to it's rapidly increasing use in places like the States and the UK for whatever ailments.
Every
and the
ailment.
issues, every
pretty much,
ailment,
yeah.
and it reducing anxiety, but also having no psychological effects. That
Yes,
great,
that one's great.
contradictory thing.
Yeah.
And the actual benefits with regard to pain that there is, some people have found, and possibly even stuff like how in the US it was a lot of them were complete junk. A lot of the CBD, wasn't it? That people was generally available, and some of them had, I believe, some of them had noids in them as well.
That's
Which will
interesting.
certainly reduce your anxiety or increase it.
Yeah.
Though that's obviously a side point, but I feel
I'm mainly familiar with kind of the stuff that people tend to use, the hemp-based products for CBD. I believe
they're just low potency.
Yeah, they tend to have such a low potency that, and you see that because real CBD products, like high CBD products, are expensive. Yeah, it's not
unbelievably,
a cheap
and
thing
you have
to
because it's going to be like it's expensive because you have to distill it like to synthesize it would be unbelievably expensive, but even to distill to get from natural hemp products, you have to distill it like hell. It's like having it's probably like unbelievably numbers of distilled and like it makes sense it would cost so much, and at that point you're having to filter off the amount of other cannabinoids and stuff like that, and but there's with regard to those kind of things, actual potency in the real world, effectiveness at different potencies, and the rising prevalence with respect to the claimed, supposed, or possible actual uses of it at different dosages, the ones available realistically and the actual effective ones. That could be a possible. I could see that being an interesting kind of new style video. But the actual overviews for all of those are going to be they're all very big ones because there's so much info on them. Even like THC, it's like what do you discuss? Someone's just said drobanol, which I believe that's the what's the name for THC, isn't it?
I believe so. Yes.
Or is it
Dronabinol? Ronabinol, I believe.
Yeah. Is that just THC or is that THC and CBD? There's one that's
THC.
just there's like two, isn't there? There's the one for for epilepsy, or they're both for epileptic people or MS. Just THC. Yeah. Like you have to cover that, and then also like also all of the stuff with regard to the videos are also essentially the videos are also quite intertwined in different ways, and there's a lot of different factors, like maybe a dronabinol kind of thing, but then it's like you may as well just discuss the whole thing, and then you may as well just discuss the history of Cuba and all of the hemp growing countries. They're just such. It's the thing with all of the most common suggestions is that there's so much info on them because they're the most popular things.
Is there a drug that has an effect on oxytocin? There are, I believe there's drugs that are being developed. I mean, oxytocin is sometimes given itself, and I think there's drugs being developed or have been developed that function like oxytocin. But one of the main things that comes to mind that I know about is MDMA is known to have an effect on hormones like oxytocin and vasopressin and some others that could play a role in the pro-social and loving effect and bonding effect that can occur and like the closeness you feel to other people while on the substance.
If I'm correct, there can be a lot of interconnectedness with regard to oxytocin and vasopressin effects as further down the line from specifically, especially serotonergic ones. If I'm thinking correctly, I might be wrong. This is where you correct me or not.
I didn't pay attention to the last little bit.
I was saying, if I'm correct, I believe that there's that there may be that in quite a few to varying extents for quite a few serotonergic substances, especially there can be down the line kind of effects on
definitely
on oxytocin and vasopressin, which obviously vary quite significantly. But I believe I can't remember what it was. I know I've seen it it's been sold as a supplement on like the whatever the very expensive supplements that sold a load of peptides. No sourcing. That place they sold oxytocin definitely as a specific on in itself supplement.
Can you talk about the N-isopropyl benzolamine cut in methamphetamine? Does it have pharmacological activity? I honestly don't know about it,
what?
So I can't comment.
What substance was it?
N-isopropyl benzolamine. Amine.
Oh, it's just N-isopropyl. Oh no,
Benzolamine.
I believe that doesn't have any. I don't believe it has any notable effects. It looks like it could have I believe it doesn't have any effect.
My friend
It may
almost
cause other side effects, but it doesn't seem to cause anything. It's the same weight and melting point, so it's used as a cutting agent because of that.
My friend almost died while taking a big dose of benzodiazepines and MDMA. I don't know if it was pure, but if it wasn't, what happened inside his body then? Well, if it wasn't, then it could have been whatever was in there. If you meant what was happening if it was the benzos and MDMA, well, it was probably primarily the MDMA, and unfortunately, just the main effect of the drug can lead to hyperthermia, which then is connected to rhabdomyolysis, which is a rapid breakdown of muscle and can cause seizures and hemorrhage and a range of psychological issues. The rhabdomyolysis can use up, due to the release of some molecules, can use up clotting factors, so you end up with a condition that's actually somewhat common in these cases, these near fatal or fatal cases of using up clotting factors leading to a condition called disseminated intravascular coagulation. And this is where you just have like uncontrolled bleeding. And so you can get people like they start bleeding from the mouth and other places and can be deadly.
I will also comment on to that quite possibly negative or overdose or possibly risky effects or settings could be for the MDMA could be a result of the benzos. Like you could not drink much liquids or
Drink too
overheat or
much.
stuff like that, or drink too much, or just essentially you're quite possibly going to be more less less acutely aware of when something's feeling not good.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. Serotonin toxicity is, to some extent, what you're actually inducing intentionally with MDMA. So you end up with a crossover of, some of the toxic effects, the indicators that things are wrong. Those are actually overlapping with the intended effects of MDMA. So the fact that you're being altered, if a medication started causing these things, you would tune into it more. But because MDMA is, has these big, substantial psychological and physical effects, especially at, a festival or in a club where you're definitely going to be sweating, you're going to feel hot. You don't tune into these things, and then it gets more out of hand. Yeah, it can be a real issue. The benzo part of it probably wasn't playing a role because benzos are usually
not
what's...
directly, but possibly with regard to how they were acting or how they responded to or how they felt. Someone just asked if the reclassification of pregabalin and gabapentin in the UK suggests the abusive properties make it less beneficial for anxiety. My comment on that is that the main reason for, firstly, long-term use of either of them consistently for a long time can cause very unpleasant withdrawals, but it's a very long time. Typically, it's like months. And the main thing with regard to that is that the push behind that was actually essentially solely from Northern Ireland, where if you've ever seen, quite possibly a few of you have seen a BBC Three documentary about it, where really the issue, and it's well known that the issue there is that a lot of it wasn't pregabalin. It was mostly just pregabalin. A lot of it wasn't pregabalin, and a lot of it was benzos or possibly opioids, but specifically fentanyl in rare cases, but quite a few of the fatal ones. But primarily, a lot of it was just people passing off benzos because pregabalin is not very financially lucrative as a black market.
What is the price like in the UK? Because here it's still exceedingly expensive.
It varies quite a lot, and based on what they were saying and all of that, the real issue is that it wasn't like no one was getting it as a prescription or as an order from legally. They were essentially all street buying from street vendors, which were not even buying from online because it's not the cheapest at all to buy from pharmacy websites, legal ones. It was by far cheaper to buy from darknet markets, and specifically much cheaper to buy junk ones from darknet markets. Because especially because they're not even pressed, they're just capsules, so it's very easy to get a hold of some plain like red and white or brown color, whatever the color is, or to
red
press
and white.
them. Though it's you, but if you just think of although it's a simple molecule, so it can be synthesized probably illicitly, somewhat simply. The main issue is that if you think of the key thing with regard to illicit production, when you don't have a natural source as a precursor that's very easy to use, or high demand for the specific product, that's where you have the cases of like MDMA or methamphetamine, opposite respectively. The main thing to consider is the actual quantitative dosage for a standard dose or a standard used dose, in that you could either synthesize 300 milligrams of pregabalin, which is a simple molecule-ish. It's pretty simple, though there's not necessarily very easy precursors to go from. Or you can bulk up some clonazepam or more potent flubromazolam or whatever, and people are probably going to believe it. Which are you going to do? You're going to bulk up the 2 milligram or 1 milligram. Just the economics make it more likely, and the same goes for fentanyl, especially when availability on darknet markets, obviously availability for in terms of prescriptions and whatever in the UK leans towards pregabalin over the others, or lent towards, though even still, the most significant thing is that in terms of the darknet markets, the availability of potent benzodiazepines or opioids far outweigh pregabalin, and also far outweigh in terms of economics. So it does just make sense that a lot of it was not pure, which was evident by the kinds of issues people were having. Even just based on that documentary, the kinds of issues people were having and the reasons, the like things associated with their deaths, in that a lot of them had like cocktails inside of them, essentially. Even just from, well, it's unclear whether that's from just the specific one or from combining, which is obviously very common as well.
But, so we're going to do a couple more questions, really, and that will be
Sorry, that was a very long answer.
No, that's fine.
Do you have any comments with regard to the UK thing? I don't think it really changes much. It was always, as much as it doesn't seem to change much of my view of it, it does kind of logically make sense based on enjoyability and just what you would logically think for pregabalin specifically with regard to its legality before.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's like, it can be used very recreationally, not necessarily dangerous at all, but it can be used very recreationally, and it was very easily available legally. But I don't think it indicates anything to the negative specifically about it.
How do you feel about the opioid lockdown by doctors? Personally, I think it's ridiculous, and I've had some toothaches lately that are so bad and ongoing, and my dentist straight up refuses to prescribe them. Yeah, I think there has been overuse of opioids in medicine, with prescriptions that too easily turn into long-term prescriptions, and possibly giving them for things that don't really require them. And the main issue there is not to the person using them, but rather the frequency with which unused opioids were just laying around people's houses, and other people could then access them and use them. And that was their introduction to opioids, especially teenagers and young adults. That's not ideal. So there has been some overuse, but the crackdown, the way it's been done, is definitely not how medicine should ever be handled. And we've had a new guidance from federal authorities. I think the FDA, might be wrong on the agency, but coming out in support of that there needs to be a return to, and this is really just emphasizing what their prior position actually was, which did not call for this unilateral reduction to X milligrams of morphine equivalent per day, which a lot of people, like in some states, practically became law, was almost like treated as such, even though it was just a guidance to be at like 90, I think, MME. And that just does not make sense to bring people forcibly down to that dose, to cut people off because you basically are scared to be prescribing and worried that if there's a little chance that the person might be abusing them, that you'll end up facing consequences for that. And it just leads to an overall, like you said, a lockdown on prescribing, such that some just do not really hand them out, even for things that it's fair.
For current users to illicit sources, it's the wrong kind of response to the issue, or at least has been interpreted incorrectly. Really, there should be firstly ways to wean people off or whatever, or
Mhm.
supports in that regard, if they're going to be reducing availability, because otherwise it's just going to go illicit. And with regard to trying to avoid more people becoming addicted or whatever, or overuse in that regard, it's not to cut off people from having one when you have a toothache. It's to cut off people. It's to ensure that the prescribed dosing regimens are short enough, appropriate, and that the things like having a load available afterwards are avoided. And it's just the kind of wrong response. It does just lead people quite possibly towards more illicit sources, and creates issues with regard to pain management for people who were otherwise would have been perfectly fine had they been prescribed it, or just are legitimately in pain and need some sort of even
And
if
you're
there's a risk for
reducing
them.
you're reducing the dose on people for whom, even if the opioids are technically now causing harm, such as in the form of opioid-induced hyperalgesia, that is, you can't respond to that with rapidly or even
Yeah,
at all reducing the dose in all cases, because you're just going to lead to people with unmanaged pain, even if unfortunately that pain has actually been exacerbated by the opioids, which is not ideal. That's why it's very preferable to not be on them for a long time if you can avoid
avoid the
that.
issue in the first place. But that's not necessarily done by just not prescribing them, or
Mm-hmm.
prescribing them at too low of a dose to manage pain. Um, in which case, you just end up scaling people up, and if anything, it can. I can imagine a situation where someone is left dealing with a pain for longer, which could increase the risk because they've had to have a ramped up dosage over time, such that they then actually become addicted because they've been using for such a long time. Whereas proper pain management needs to be reasonably administered
Mm-hmm.
and done for sensible periods of time, with the consideration for the addictive potential.
Mm-hmm.
And not just cutting people off cold turkey, especially because you either have a pain management problem there a lot of the time, or you have the resolving of that, in quotes, by shifting to illicit sources by the person, which is obviously also not good.
And Elliot noted that it was the CDC that came out with the new guidance. So thank you for that. Yeah, it's FDA did not sound
That
right.
makes
I'm not
sense.
sure
Yeah,
why I went on that.
CDC. I was going to say FDA makes sense, but no, CDC does make sense because it's the addiction issue
Seth, do you believe, and
disease.
this is kind of connected to this topic, that the opioid epidemic is propaganda? They've been a user for over 10 years and they've seen no significant increase in users. Yeah, I think it's
Something can be
definitely
a real
framed
thing but
wrong.
still be used as propaganda.
Yeah, well, the thing that's going on, and this is the problem with calling it an opioid epidemic, is that suggests some significant rise in the users of heroin uh, now, because heroin and fentanyls make up the majority of these fatalities that we're concerned about. And it suggests this massive change in users, but really, there's been a much bigger change in the safety of the supply than there has been in the number of users. And especially for things like heroin, where the user stats have not really changed. Also, the focus on prescribing makes no sense when prescribing has been low relative to its peak for years now, yet the deaths are still increasing, meaning
The
that
prescribing
those.
issues in the past, it's the management of the safety of illicit users, such as
Mhm.
like injecting safe injection sites, and trying to get people on Suboxone or equivalents, methadone, those kind of treatments that are where probably the real uh, concentration should be at this point, at least. Obviously, don't allow ridiculous increases in prescribing. Obviously, that's essential. That doesn't need to be enforced now. It seems.
Mhm.
It seems that that's kind of that has already been enforced to the extent that, or has gotten them enough heat to the extent that it won't, like, it's not where the issue should be concentrated on now
So,
specifically?
unfortunately, I have some other stuff that I do have to get to, and we've also been going for substantially longer than I anticipated. It's been 2
It's
hours.
11 o'clock.
But this has been a great stream. Thank you to everybody who's been asking questions. Of course, there's stuff that I did not get to. Hopefully, one of the things you can definitely do is join the chat room, and the link is on the screen. So the bit.ly link, so bit.ly/TDC Discord. It's a chat room where I'm active, Ben is active, and others are active, and you can ask the questions there and probably get everything answered. And if you want to support via donations, then you can do so through Patreon, PayPal, or Bitcoin. The link for all that is it's in the description to this, and it's also on the screen. You can find all the information at thedrugclassroom.com/support, and you can also follow on social media, Facebook and Twitter, The Drug Classroom for Facebook and Drug Classroom on Twitter. Thank you again to everybody who's been watching. It's been great. And thank you to Ben for being here. And we are out.
You're welcome. Bye.